Hey there riders, Moto Journo Kris here this morning, and I thought I'd give you my full thoughts on Yamaha's R7. Now this is quite an interesting machine because it's been introduced to coincide with the R6, so Yamaha's traditionally very super sport focused and very dominant super sport machine, going track only, and this becoming essentially the road option. And now some people have said, oh well, the R7 is replacing the R6, and I don't think that is exactly true. I think the reality is that the R6 is a very track-centric weapon. Yamaha have recognized that, and that's what it's going to be sold for, and it does carry a real premium price tag. And Yamaha have looked at the segment and decided, what can we put in that will hopefully have greater success than the R6 as far as selling for a road bike? Because realistically speaking, I think we are seeing some quite big changes in the trends of motorcycles. Super sports and super bikes are certainly on the downward trend. Other more usable everyday machines are on a bit more of an upward trend, and the R7 seems to fill that kind of niche. Yamaha have really done something a little bit different. It sits somewhere between the 650 beginner or intermediate perhaps machines, which a lot of people take as their first machines, but below the super sport machine. So it's somewhere in between the two there. It's a little bit of a compromise between those two categories, but certainly I think it has a lot of potential. And with how the super sport segment is doing quite poorly, I think this perhaps will do significantly better and be a much more road orientated machine, which more people are interested in buying and having in their shed as really possibly an everyday machine, but also a great machine for having some sporty riding and even going to a track day occasionally. Particularly if you're thinking about getting into track days, I think this would be a very rewarding machine. So if that is on your horizon and you're wanting a sports bike that's going to be an easy entry point into going to the track, and you don't have like a 400 or you want something bigger than a 400, definitely consider the R7. And also, as a very quick rundown, these are 15K on the road here in Australia, so that's the Australian price. You can get the restricted lambs version, which is a smaller capacity, for 14. So that is if you weren't after the 75 horsepower and you wanted the 35 kilowatts or about 50 horsepower, is an option. In the UK, it is 8,000 pounds, I believe, or maybe 82,000 pounds. In the US, it's 9,000 US dollars. But most importantly, let's talk about how Yamaha's new YZF-R7 is to ride. Okay, so let's talk about handling on the R7. I do really rate the handling on this bike. Now, it isn't telepathic like some bikes that you'll come across where essentially you almost don't need to think and it just goes where you want. It's not quite at that point. However, it is a very nicely set up system in my opinion. And keeping in mind I'm a road rider, I'm not the fastest rider. And this is just my impression of really how I think the bike goes. And certainly I think it's going to be a rewarding machine for the more road orientated rider, perhaps not quite as performance orientated and not quite as fast a rider as people who are interested in the full super sports. But again, that's where I think the strength of this bike is. So low speed, nice and agile, very easy thing. As I said, it feels lighter handling than the super sports and certainly the super bikes. Despite having the drop-down bars, which obviously have only, a limited amount of turning in them, you don't feel like your hands are getting trapped in here. It's still fairly roomy. I feel like it's quite an easy bike to jump onto and to ride, and that extends from riding around town, where that easy handling certainly makes it quite easy to avoid potholes and things like that. And it's, while still a committed full super sport style machine, it doesn't feel like you're overly committed like on some of the really extreme machines. The handling, as I said, agile, nimble. As the speeds rise, certainly you can pick any line you want through the corner. The S22 tyres are exceptional. They're a nice sporty tyre, good grip in all conditions. Really impressed with those. I've done a lot of time on S21s. The R7 has a very kind of controllable linear fall onto the side of the tyre. It's not an overly aggressive handling characteristic. And I feel like some of the character from the MT-07, which is a really easygoing machine as far as the handling, is here on the R7 as well. And with the R7, again, as the speeds rise, it's still a very, very easy machine to hustle along. Very stable on the side of the tyre when you're leant over through the corners. And yeah, very forgiving. It wasn't the kind of machine where you really feel like you have to set everything up perfectly, and that also might be a reflection of me not being the fastest rider. So riding on the roads, I leave a good bit of room for safety, and certainly on the R7, honestly, from a handling perspective, while I wouldn't say it's the best in the category, I would probably be happiest on this riding hard on the road. And I say that coming from, say, a Daytona 675, which I sold, which had full Öhlins suspension. So I do think that is quite a good note in the R7's favour. Now, I certainly didn't do any track riding on the bike, so that has put a little bit of a limitation on how fast I could ride it, essentially speaking. However, I do really think this would be a great machine, again, at the track, particularly from the handling perspective, because it's, I guess, the thing I keep coming back to, nice and confidence inspiring and quite forgiving a machine. And that means that you can ride a little bit harder and expand your skills and things like that. Now let's talk about the suspension. This is one point that has come up. It has the fully adjustable forks on the front, 43 mils, so you're getting your full adjustability there, and certainly the front suspension system I thought was well set up. I didn't touch a clicker. I normally try and test the bikes just as standard to get a bit of an idea of really how the bike comes out of the box, and in that regard the front end really, really good. Particularly, you know, support hard onto the brakes, exceptional. And that does come back to the brake performance, which I'll talk about in a second. The area that I would have said was probably the weakest is the shock on this bike. There were times when I was riding at, you know, like a casual, say 80 kilometers an hour through the twisties, where I was getting pushed out of the seat by the harsher bumps. Now, around town, pretty good, even though obviously it's a sports bike style machine. It hasn't got really plush suspension, it has sporty suspension, that's what you expect. And the rear shock around town, I would say, was well within reason. And I've got to say, most of the super sport style machines aren't great around town and aren't great at lower speeds over harsh bumps. It's just the style of suspension they've got because they're designed more for the track. And in that regard, the R7 was somewhat similar. That rear was a little bit harsh. However, I did find as I rode a bit harder, the rear suspension did perform better. So while I will say perhaps when you're taking it a bit easy through the twisties and things like that, which is sometimes all you can do because of our speed limits, there the rear suspension wasn't so great. When I was pushing quite a bit harder, I felt like it did perform significantly better. It took a lot of the harshness out of the rebound at the rear, and overall I was very, very happy with that, particularly for a sports bike style machine with proper sporty suspension. And I have no doubt that I'd really like this at the track if I was to do the occasional track day with that suspension where you'd appreciate it. So overall, I think probably again, the shock, the weakest part of the chassis setup, I guess you would say. So I'm only 70 kilos, so normally I can work within the standard suspension, but realistically speaking, I was pretty happy with that setup. Okay, so here's probably one area where my opinion is going to differ from a lot of other riders. Again, coming back to me being just a road rider and by no means the fastest rider out there. The Yamaha brake setup, so that's the 4-piston calipers, dual front discs, Brembo master cylinder, it is not the most powerful braking setup, and it is also not certainly the most aggressive. If anything, I would say I find it nicely balanced for the R7's overall package. But, you know, it's not like a Brembo set of calipers with really bitey pads in it. There's fairly gentle bite on these from all of my riding. The power is pretty good. It's got quite a linear kind of response from that lever. The more force you put in, the more braking performance you get. The lack of bite does mean, I think, that the feel perhaps isn't as intimate as you might want it to be. And for people who want a really aggressive brake system, I've no doubt that they will probably find this brake setup a little bit disappointing, which is fair enough. But I do think that the style of the bike, which is just that little bit more laid back than a pure super sport or a super bike, and the suspension setup as well, which is very well supported for that brake performance, I think it's well balanced overall. But it's not going to be like it's going to be something that some people will probably complain bitterly about if they're expecting really crazy performance. Now, you might be able to add a bit more bite to that front end, and that might give a little bit more feel. However, I thought the modulation of the front brakes was good. I thought the power was good. When I started riding a little bit harder, to start off with, I was kind of thinking to myself, maybe there is not quite enough braking performance there. However, I continued riding harder, and to be honest, I found, when a couple of times when the rear was getting very, very light on those front brakes, I was thinking, no, actually, that's a good setup as far as I'm concerned. And again, I'm not the hardest rider out there. Rear brake, pretty gentle, good for stability around corners, just using a little brake through. Good around town at very, very low speeds, but certainly not a super powerful brake. There is ABS on the front. The only time I got a twitch out of the front was over a big bump where I was braking over the bump, and obviously the wheel lost a little bit of traction going over the bump. Felt it come in there. So I will say I find the brake, chassis and suspension setup nicely balanced for the bike, but as I mentioned, probably not as impressive on the braking front as some of the pure supersport machines, particularly those with the very aggressive Brembo setups. However, I'm quite happy with that personally, which is a subjective choice that's going to come down to the rider. Talking about the heart of the R7, we're going back to the MT-07 power plant, the CP2 parallel twin. That is a 689cc parallel twin, 270-degree crank, and I would say it's one of my favorite engines, not because it provides extreme performance or it's ridiculously crazy. I like it because the way it puts power to the ground, I think, is second to none. It's got quite a bit of character for a parallel twin in a class which doesn't really generally have that much character, and it is a very easy to use, a very flexible engine. And as I said, the way it puts power to the ground is very confidence inspiring, which certainly means that riding this bike hard is easy. It's easy, it's fun, it's rewarding, and I do really like the power plant. 75 horsepower is on the low side of things, even compared to something like the CBR 650R, which I think has 90 horsepower. However, I think just the sheer usability of the engine makes it a real gem. In the R7, it feels like there's a bit of a lighter flywheel effect in it, so certainly just the momentum of the engine is a little bit more throttle driven as far as what you're doing because of that light flywheel effect. It's not as punchy and torquey down low as on, say, the MT-07. It feels like they've spread that torque a lot more evenly through the rev range, which again gives it a nicer top end, where on the MT-07 I'd say the top end kind of dies off a little bit and gets a bit flat, whereas on the R7 I think it carries through and it revs right up to that rev line around 10,000 RPM, and that makes it a really, really fun thing. I mean, like 140 in third gear is certainly doable, and it pulls nicely all the way up to the top of that rev range, and nice tall gears. The gearbox is quite clunky. Solid shifts though, as long as you're getting the action right. Do have to watch the return on that shifter, because I noticed if I didn't let it fully return, it wouldn't shift. And into neutral, it was a little bit finicky at times when the bike had been parked, and I'd have to give it a little bit of a rev and move the bike a little bit to knock it down into first gear from neutral. However, certainly no big complaints there. I think the clunky gearbox is a little bit more typical, but I will say that the clutch is nice and light. I was quite happy with that. Perhaps not Ninja 400 light, where you can barely feel there's a lever there at all, but a very nice light system, and that is a cable clutch system. So quite impressive there. Disappointingly, no quick shifter. I would have loved to see that standard on the bike. And I guess I'd say for the price, I still think they probably could have got that in there if they really wanted to, but we'll see what happens in the future. I think it's not a necessity, it's a nice quality of life feature that would have been great to see on the bike. I will say my one observation about the performance from the engine, so around town off a closed throttle, stopped, very, very nice power delivery, very nice fueling, so getting started in those conditions good. At times it was a little bit rough bringing the throttle back on from a closed throttle, but rolling along obviously in traffic and things like that, where perhaps I wasn't in first gear, I was in, say, second gear, and I was bringing the throttle back on. That could be a little bit rough, but could just be a rider issue there. As far as the top end, from say 160, it did feel like it got a little bit flatter. where that may have been me upshifting too many gears and not keeping it right up high in the rev range through those taller gears. However, I will say probably the difference I noticed there is the supersport machines, they do tend to pull a bit harder at those taller speeds, whereas this was a little bit more typical of like a lot of those naked bike options, which they taper off a little bit at a slightly lower speed, which is not surprising by any means. As far as the performance through the more usable sections of what you're going to be using on the road legally, from 60 up to 120, 140, very, very nice power and torque delivery, really impressive. Like I said, flexible, confidence inspiring, nice transitions through the gears, onto the engine braking quite aggressively, handled with ease with that slipper clutch, very, very nice there. And certainly the slipper clutch isn't so light as to have no engine braking, so you can quite actively use that to decelerate. So again, something that I really like. Okay, so if there was one area that I'd criticize the R7 for, it would be the exhaust. It's a little bit quiet, but that's the expectation these days. Even mechanically, it's quite a quiet bike. There is a nice little burble on the decel in some situations, especially knocking it down through the gears. But overall, it doesn't have the audible character that a lot of people love on their motorcycles, and you'll need to put an aftermarket system on really to achieve that. And that might reduce, at times there was a little bit of heat coming up around my ankles and up my shins, and I think that was mainly when I was stuck in traffic and obviously there wasn't much airflow, and an aftermarket exhaust which is going to flow a bit more freely will probably solve that issue. Let's talk about the ergonomics of this bike, because as I said, while I wouldn't consider it a pure super sport, it certainly has the super sport ergos, and you can see that with proper clip-on bars, you know, quite aggressively recessed into the fairings there. It's got the rear sets on it. It's got a very aggressive, again, seat. There is room for a pillion, but certainly by no means a major consideration. It is a very narrow seat. It's an 835mm seat height. It is 188 kilos, I believe, fully fueled, ready to go, which is fairly normal, but this bike does feel very, very light, and certainly the narrow seat makes it an easy bike to jump onto. So it's a 180 centimeter rider with a 32-inch inseam. As you can see here, I can get both feet down flat quite easily. Nicely kind of integrated into the lines of the bike, easy to grab on under the tank there, and there is a fair bit of room for someone with longer legs, which is good. That's probably a more normal riding position, a bit of bend in the arms. You're not collapsing onto those grips, and you're not basically locking your elbows. So a little bit of bend in those, holding up your weight through your back and your core muscles. And as far as getting in on the bike, so very much the full super sport ergo, which is what you're after if you're after a true super sport machine. However, obviously that is quite different than a lot of the 650 sports bikes, which have the taller bars, lower seat heights. They're not as committed in the riding position. So as far as the riding position from a super sport perspective, you are getting the real deal here. And I guess the points that stand out to me is that it feels a bit lighter than the super sport machines, particularly at low speeds and things like that. On a lot of those, and particularly on the bigger super bikes, I always feel like the front ends are quite heavy, but for whatever reason I feel like the R7 is quite light in comparison, and certainly an easy thing to jump onto. And I do think it's probably a little bit more new rider friendly as a result, not only in the restricted versions, which have less power for new riders, but also in the full power version. Now again, talking about the controls, we've got a fairly simple setup here. Left switch with basically a select and a reset button, and that's for your dash, that's for the TFD to dash. It's a very nice, kind of cool but simple dash. It does have a little bit of a sun protector over the top of it. Other than that, you've got some hazard lights, you've got a flasher, which is something I like to see because helps you kind of, you know, if there's something going on up ahead and you want to warn someone that you're coming along. While you're braking or taking evasive action, you can use the flasher. Horn, indicators, high beam, low beam, start, and like I said, very, very simple. So it doesn't have an electronics package, so there isn't a heap of stuff to worry about. As far as the features, there is a Brembo master cylinder, radial master cylinder, which is nice to see, adjustable lever on that side, non-adjustable clutch lever, and there is good vision through those mirrors for a super sport style machine, and there's quite a generous screen here which offers good wind protection, particularly when you're crouched down behind the bike. But overall, I think Yamaha's R7, it's a really cool machine. It's got a beautiful finish quality. Obviously, there's a lot of plastic because it's a faired bike, as you can see here. You've got obviously all the fairings, but the painted fairings, they've got a nice deep blue, bit of metal sparkle to it as well. The overall finish quality is really, really good, and that does put it, you know, a step above most of those 400cc little super sports. Obviously, this is twice the price here in Australia, but I think if I was looking for kind of a full-size super sport with a bit more power than the Ninja 400 we have at the moment, this would be top of my list. I like the ergos, I like the styling, I like what Yamaha have done. I love that CP2 parallel twin, the 270-degree crank. It's a really, really good engine despite being not that, you know, high on power. Really nice torque. The lack of electronics to me is actually a benefit. It won't be for everyone, but I think ABS is enough, especially with a tractable engine like this. You don't need traction control or anything like that. Anyway, very impressed with the offering from Yamaha. It won't be for everyone, but hopefully we'll find lots of people who are really interested in this machine. If you've got any questions about the bike, just let me know in the comments down below. I'll do my best to answer them. As always, stay safe out there. Thanks for watching, and you can support the channel on Patreon.